If you think you know what power looks like, you have never seen it choose restraint. The morning air at Camp Weatherby carried a damp chill that settled into wool and bone. 52 degrees under a pale English sky, the kind of cold that never shouted but lingered. 8 German women stood in formation near the wire, boots aligned on gravel measured in neat white lines, shoulders squared not out of pride, but survival. And Liesel Hartmann kept her gaze lowered the way she had learned to do. Not submissive, just careful. Rumors had reached them before the transfer, stories of British soldiers, disciplined, distant, impossible to read. And Liesel had prepared herself for the familiar script of war, the hard stare, the careless laugh, the subtle humiliation that reminded prisoners where they stood. Instead she heard it first, the rhythm of boots approaching across 30 yards of packed earth, steady and synchronized, not rushed, not theatrical. When she looked up, only for a second, she saw them. Khaki pressed sharp, brass catching the thin light, faces composed as if carved from something older than anger. No one whistled, no one smirked. They simply took their positions along the yard as if order itself were a language they spoke fluently. Captain William Carter stood at the center, gloves folded in one hand, posture straight but unforced, eyes scanning the perimeter before resting briefly on the prisoners, not lingering, not stripping them of dignity with curiosity. Liesel felt it then, the disruption of expectation. She had been told that enemies were loud in victory, careless in authority. These men were neither. A gust of wind moved across the compound, carrying the faint scent of coal smoke from somewhere beyond the camp, and one of the younger women beside Liesel shifted her weight, boots scraping against gravel. The sound seemed too loud in the quiet. A private stepped forward instinctively, not aggressive, simply alert. For half a heartbeat the yard held its breath. Carter raised his hand. 2 inches, no more, and the movement was enough. The private stopped. Nothing else followed. No reprimand, no display. Just control. Liesel could not stop staring because she had never seen command exercised so quietly. Power, in her experience, had always announced itself. This did not. It adjusted a cuff, straightened a line, corrected without spectacle. She noticed details the others missed. The way Carter's boots were dusted but polished. The way he kept exactly 3 feet of distance when addressing them. The way his voice carried without rising. When he spoke, it was brief and measured, outlining work assignments, meal times, expectations. The words were ordinary. The tone was not. It carried an assumption of order that did not depend on fear. Somewhere behind her, a woman exhaled slowly. Liesel realized she had been holding her own breath. This was the first look, the first fracture in the story she had been given. Not admiration, not relief. Something steadier, recognition. The war had rearranged the world into enemies and uniforms. But in that yard, under a sky the color of unpolished steel, she witnessed something unfamiliar. Men who understood that discipline was not about dominance, but about what you refused to do when you had the authority to do it. By mid-morning the temperature had climbed to 63 degrees, the thin sunlight sharpening the edges of the barracks and turning the gravel yard almost silver, and the women were assigned to inventory duty inside a long storage shed that smelled of canvas, soap, and damp wood. Liesel moved with deliberate precision, counting crates, folding uniforms left behind by previous transfers, her fingers steady even when her thoughts were not. Through the open doorway, she could see the British soldiers rotating posts every 2 hours exactly. No shouting, no unnecessary motion, just the quiet exchange of position marked by the soft click of heels and the faint rustle of wool. Discipline here did not feel theatrical. It felt practiced. Anna Weiss, the youngest among them at 19, leaned closer and whispered that she had expected arrogance, something theatrical and cruel. And Liesel answered only with a slight shake of her head, because what unsettled her was not cruelty but the absence of it. Just before noon a small incident tested the fragile calm. One of the supply ledgers was missing, misplaced among stacked footlockers, and a corporal at the doorway stiffened at the sight of disorder. The room tightened. Liesel recognized the shift instantly, the way attention narrowed when authority sensed imperfection. Captain Carter entered without hurry, gloves tucked beneath his arm, gaze sweeping once across the interior. He did not raise his voice. He asked who had handled The last shipment. His tone carried expectation rather than accusation. Liesel stepped forward, stating that she had organized the crates at 8:15 that morning and had placed the ledger on the second shelf from the left. She spoke clearly, meeting his eyes only long enough to confirm understanding. He listened. That was the first surprise. He listened fully before responding. He moved to the shelf, adjusted 2 stacked blankets, and retrieved the ledger from beneath them where it had slipped. No reprimand followed. No lecture about responsibility. Only a nod and a brief instruction to secure the shelf more carefully. The corporal relaxed. The air in the shed seemed to expand again. As the women resumed their tasks, Liesel felt the unfamiliar weight of something close to respect forming in the silence. Outside, a kettle of water was set on a portable burner near the yard office, steam rising in a thin white ribbon against the gray sky. Carter poured tea into a tin cup and stood 3 feet from the doorway, not intruding, not retreating. He removed his gloves and folded them once before placing them on the windowsill. A small gesture of ease that suggested confidence rather than dominance. Anna watched from the corner of her eye and murmured that no one had barked an order, and that alone felt strange. Liesel noticed the distance he kept, the exact measure of space preserved between guard and prisoner, as if boundaries were not weapons but lines of mutual protection. When the noon bell rang, the soldiers stepped back in unison to allow the women to pass toward the mess hall without crowding them. It was a simple adjustment, almost invisible, yet it rearranged the geometry of the yard. Liesel understood then that what held the camp together was not fear but consistency. The rules were clear, applied without spectacle, and within that structure there was room for dignity. She straightened the collar of her gray uniform and walked forward with steady steps, aware that something inside her had shifted again, not softened, not surrendered, but recalibrated. In a place defined by captivity, the most radical sight was not power displayed, but power restrained by choice. The afternoon settled over Camp Weatherby with a muted stillness, the sky a low ceiling of gray that pressed gently against the chimneys beyond the fence, and by 3 o'clock the wind had shifted, carrying the faint scent of rain across the yard. Liesel was assigned to assist in the infirmary corner of the administrative building, a narrow room no larger than 12 by 15 feet where shelves held bandages, tonic bottles, and neatly labeled tins. She had once trained as a medical aide, and though the war had scattered her life into fragments, her hands still remembered how to measure temperature and steady breath. Anna sat on a wooden chair near the window, pale from the morning's strain, insisting she was fine. Liesel placed 2 fingers against her wrist and counted silently, aware of the quiet footsteps approaching down the corridor. Captain Carter paused at the threshold, removing his cap before stepping inside, as if entering a place that required a different tone. He did not hover. He asked a single question in a calm voice, whether the young woman needed rest or water. Liesel answered that it was only fatigue and that a cup of tea would help. He nodded once and left without comment. Through the open door, she saw him speak briefly to a private, then return carrying a metal cup, steam rising in a thin ribbon. He set it on the table within reach and stepped back the same measured 3 feet she had come to expect. No gesture lingered longer than necessary. No word exceeded its purpose. Anna accepted the cup with a small tremor in her hand and whispered thank you in careful English. Carter inclined his head, nothing more. Outside, a light rain began, tapping softly against the window panes, turning the yard dark and reflective. Soldiers adjusted their posts without complaint, coats drawn tighter, boots shifting on wet gravel. Liesel watched through the glass as Carter walked the perimeter, checking that each guard remained sheltered from the worst of the wind, offering brief instructions that carried no edge. It struck her then that authority here moved in circles rather than straight lines, returning to ensure that what was ordered was also sustained. When he passed the infirmary window again, their eyes met for the briefest second, not charged, not sentimental, simply aware. She realized she no longer looked away immediately. Something in her posture had altered since the morning. Shoulders no longer curved inward but aligned with the quiet structure around her. The rain thickened, tracing silver lines down the glass, and the yard grew almost reflective, as if the entire camp had paused to consider itself. Inside the small room, Anna's color began to Return, and Liesel adjusted the blanket over her knees with deliberate care. Beyond the door, the measured cadence of boots continued, steady as a metronome. She understood now that what unsettled her most was not kindness but consistency. This was not a performance for prisoners. It was a standard applied without audience. In the fading light of that damp English afternoon, Liesel felt the last pieces of an old certainty loosen and fall away, replaced not with admiration but with clarity. Discipline, she saw, was not loud. It was patient, and in that patience, even within the narrow boundaries of captivity, there was room enough for a human being to stand upright. Evening came early beneath the thick English clouds, and by 6 o'clock the rain had softened into a fine mist that clung to wool coats and darkened the gravel into a muted sheen. The yard lamps flickered on one by one, casting pale circles of light that turned the barbed wire into thin lines of silver. Inside the administrative corridor, a new tension gathered, subtle but present. When a senior British officer arrived unannounced for inspection, his boots carried a sharper rhythm, his gaze measuring not only the prisoners but the guards themselves. Liesel stood near the infirmary doorway, hands folded neatly, observing without appearing to observe. She sensed the shift in posture among the soldiers, shoulders tightening by an inch, voices lowering half a tone. Captain William Carter met the visiting officer at the center of the yard, posture unchanged, gloves folded behind his back. Their exchange was brief and controlled, yet the air between them carried weight. The senior officer gestured toward the women's compound, questioning procedures, questioning leniency, questioning the visible ease that had settled into the routine. Carter listened fully before responding, his voice even, outlining regulations, daily schedules, documented compliance. He did not apologize. He did not harden. He simply stated facts. The conversation ended without raised voices, but the message was clear. Standards would be observed. As the inspection moved on, a minor complication arose. One of the supply crates had been left unlocked in the shed, an oversight that could be interpreted as carelessness. The senior officer paused, eyes narrowing slightly. Before any reprimand could form, Carter stepped forward and accepted responsibility, explaining that he had authorized access during inventory and had ensured no materials were missing. He spoke without defensiveness, only clarity. The silence that followed was long enough to measure. Then the senior officer nodded once and continued down the path. The moment dissolved, yet its echo remained. Liesel felt it in the way the guards resumed their posts, not hurried, not chastened, but steady. She understood what had happened without needing explanation. Authority had been tested, not by force, but by scrutiny, and it had chosen consistency over display. Later, as the mist thickened and the compound settled into the muted rhythm of evening, Anna approached Liesel quietly and whispered that she had never expected to witness an officer defend procedure without humiliation. Liesel did not answer immediately. She watched Captain Carter walk the perimeter once more, stopping briefly to adjust a lantern so its light covered a darker stretch near the fence. He moved with the same measured pace he had shown that morning, unchanged by inspection, unchanged by doubt. Something within her aligned with that steadiness. Captivity had narrowed her world to schedules and boundaries. Yet within those lines she saw a model of control that did not depend on fear. The rain finally stopped, leaving the air cool at 50 degrees, and a thin fog began to rise from the ground. In that softened landscape, the camp no longer felt like a stage for dominance, but a structure defined by restraint. Liesel straightened her coat and inhaled deeply, aware that the most powerful shift of the day had not been spoken aloud. It had been demonstrated, and in that demonstration, she recognized a truth that unsettled her more than hostility ever could. Dignity, once shown without spectacle, quietly demands to be matched. The fog did not lift the next morning. It settled low across Camp Weatherby like a held breath, blurring the fence line until metal and sky became one pale horizon. At 6:30 the bell rang, not harsh, just precise, and the women formed ranks on gravel still damp from the night before. Liesel felt the cool air, 48 degrees, slide into her lungs as she stepped into position, shoulders level, chin steady. Something had changed inside her, subtle but firm. The previous evening had shown Her that authority here could withstand scrutiny without turning sharp, and that knowledge rested quietly beneath her composure. Captain William Carter walked the front line with a clipboard tucked beneath his arm, boots measured in. Pace, eyes attentive without lingering. He stopped at each position not to intimidate but to observe, confirming posture, confirming readiness. When he reached Liesel, he paused a fraction longer than protocol required. There was no smile, no unnecessary exchange. He asked if the infirmary supplies had been reorganized after the rain. She answered that they had, listing the items secured against moisture. He listened fully, then nodded once. That single nod carried acknowledgement, not praise. As the formation dispersed toward work assignments, a sudden shift rippled through the yard. A supply wagon entering through the outer gate struck a shallow rut in the mud, tilting slightly and scattering several wooden crates onto the damp ground. The sound broke the morning's symmetry. A few guards moved instinctively forward. Tension gathered in small increments. Liesel saw it unfold in silence. Carter stepped toward the wagon without haste. Assessing rather than reacting, he directed two soldiers to stabilize the wheel and motioned for the prisoners nearest the crates to step back until footing was secure. No accusation passed his lips. No assumption of blame attached to the nearest figure. When the wheel was steadied, he turned to the women and asked for assistance in lifting the lighter boxes, careful to specify weight and placement. It was an instruction framed as cooperation, not command for humiliation. Liesel bent to grasp one corner of a crate, feeling the damp wood. Beneath her palms, she noticed that Carter matched the pace of those around him, lifting another crate himself rather than delegating entirely. The gesture was not dramatic. It was practical. The wagon was restored upright within minutes. Order returned. The yard resumed its rhythm as though the interruption had been absorbed rather than amplified. Anna exhaled beside her, whispering that in another camp such a disruption might have invited reprimand. Liesel did not answer. She watched Carter adjust his cuff, retrieve his clipboard, and resume inspection without commentary. The fog began to thin, revealing the fence line once more, straight and unbroken. In that clearing light, she recognized the deeper pattern forming across these days. Discipline here did not escalate tension. It diffused it. Control did not humiliate. It steadied. She felt her own stance align with that standard, not out of allegiance, but out of recognition. In a world defined by confinement, she had witnessed something rarer than leniency. She had witnessed measured authority that neither flaunted nor faltered. And as the morning settled into its quiet cadence, Liesel understood that the most powerful shift of all was not what they were forced to endure, but what they were being shown was possible. Strength that chose restraint, again and again, until it no longer needed to prove itself at all. By late afternoon the sky had cleared to a pale wash of blue. The earlier fog burned away by a thin but steady sun that pushed the temperature to 61 degrees, and the camp seemed almost ordinary in that light. Laundry lines stretched between barracks, gray fabric moving in a slow rhythm, boots drying outside doorways, voices low but no longer edged with constant tension. Liesel stood near the storage shed reviewing inventory notes she had rewritten in careful English, each letter deliberate, each number aligned. She had begun translating small labels for the infirmary shelves without being asked, not as a favor, not as submission, but as order restored through clarity. Across the yard, Captain William Carter conferred briefly with a sergeant, his posture unchanged, the conversation measured and brief. There was no dramatic gesture, only the quiet exchange of responsibility. A new delivery arrived at 4:15, crates marked with medical supplies, and this time the wagon rolled smoothly across the gravel. Still, Carter inspected the wheels before allowing it fully inside. Attention given not because disaster was expected, but because prevention was standard. Liesel noticed how predictability itself had become reassuring. Nothing here relied on improvisation or impulse. Everything followed a line. When the crates were unloaded, one was found slightly damaged at the corner, a splintered edge exposing folded linens inside. A private looked uncertain, glancing between the crate and his superior. Carter stepped forward, crouched slightly, examined the corner, and simply said that the linens would be repacked and the crate repaired before storage. No irritation, no visible disappointment. The correction was practical and complete. Liesel felt something settle inside her at that moment. She had grown accustomed to authority that searched for fault as proof of control. This authority searched for solutions. Anna approached her quietly and said that she no longer felt the same tightness in her chest each morning. Liesel understood. Fear thrives on unpredictability. Here, the lines were drawn and kept. As evening approached, the bell signaled the end of work detail, and the prisoners were guided back toward their compound with the same 3 feet of distance maintained. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows that stretched across the yard like parallel lines. Carter paused near the fence, observing the final head count. When the numbers matched the roster, he closed the ledger without flourish. Liesel caught sight of his reflection in the small office window, hat tucked beneath his arm, expression calm but not complacent. It occurred to her that restraint required more effort than dominance. To hold power and not display it demanded discipline of its own. The sky turned a softer shade of gold before fading toward dusk, and a cool breeze returned, carrying the faint scent of grass from beyond the wire. Liesel rested her hands against the wooden rail of the compound and looked outward, not with longing, not with despair, but with a steadier gaze. She realized that the reason she and the others could not stop watching these men was not curiosity alone. It was recognition. They were witnessing a standard held consistently, even when unobserved. In a place defined by confinement, that consistency had begun to reshape the atmosphere itself. And as the last light withdrew from the yard, Liesel stood a little straighter, understanding that dignity, once seen clearly, quietly asks to be reflected in return. The next morning arrived with a sharper wind, steady at 15 miles per hour, sweeping across the yard and snapping the laundry lines into taut angles against the sky. The temperature hovered near 50 degrees, cool enough to stiffen fingers, but not halt routine. Liesel stood in formation with the others, her posture no longer shaped by instinctive caution but by something steadier. She had begun to measure the day not by anxiety but by pattern. The bell rang at precisely 6:30, boots aligned, names were called, numbers matched. The cadence of order continued. Yet beneath that order, something subtle was unfolding. During work detail in the storage shed, a disagreement surfaced between 2 prisoners over assigned tasks, voices rising just enough to disturb the careful symmetry of the room. In another place, tension might have spread quickly, turning sharp and public. Here, it paused. Captain William Carter stepped inside without haste, not summoned but attentive. He did not demand silence. He waited. The raised voices lowered on their own. He asked a single question, calm and direct, inviting each woman to explain her understanding of the assignment. There was no sarcasm, no visible impatience. Liesel watched closely, noting the way he maintained equal distance from both speakers, neither favoring nor dismissing. When the explanation concluded, he clarified the schedule, adjusted the rotation to ensure fairness, and reminded them that consistency depended on cooperation. His tone carried expectation, not warning. The room settled. The air shifted from friction to alignment. As he turned to leave, he paused briefly at the doorway and added that discipline meant more than following orders. It meant upholding them when no one was watching. The words were simple. Their effect lingered. Later, outside in the yard, Liesel observed him inspecting a row of lanterns, ensuring each wick was trimmed evenly before nightfall. No one had requested it. No audience gathered. It was maintenance performed because it mattered. She felt the realization settle deeper within her. The reason the women could not stop observing these men was not fascination with uniform or accent. It was the rare sight of authority applied evenly across circumstance. Fear had once trained her to scan for threat. Now she scanned for pattern. At midday, clouds thinned and sunlight spilled across the compound, warming the gravel to nearly 60 degrees. Shadows shortened. A private slipped slightly on loose stones near the gate, catching himself before falling. Carter noticed, not with criticism, but with attention. He directed that the stones be leveled to prevent further imbalance. Prevention, not punishment. Correction, not spectacle. Liesel inhaled the crisp air and felt her own internal posture align with the standard she witnessed daily. Captivity had narrowed her physical world, but it had not narrowed her capacity to observe. What she saw now was not softness. It was strength expressed without display. As the afternoon progressed, the rhythm of boots continued, measured and predictable. The yard remained orderly, not because tension suppressed it, but because consistency sustained it. When evening approached and the sky deepened toward gray, Liesel realized that the transformation she felt was not sudden. It was incremental, day by day, gesture by gesture. Restraint had redrawn the emotional landscape of the camp, and as the wind carried the faint scent of damp earth across the fence line, she understood that dignity, once modeled without exception, does not ask for admiration. It quietly sets the bar higher for everyone within its reach. The following day began with an unusual stillness, the wind absent, the sky stretched wide and pale above Camp Weatherby, and for the first time in nearly a week the air felt almost mild at 64 degrees. Sunlight pooled across the gravel yard, warming the wooden barracks and softening the harsh lines of the wire fence. Liesel noticed the change immediately because silence without wind carried every sound farther, every footstep clearer. Morning formation proceeded as it always had, names called, numbers confirmed, boots aligned with measured precision. Yet beneath the routine there was a subtle anticipation, as if the camp itself sensed something approaching. By mid-morning a transport truck rolled through the outer gate, carrying additional administrative staff assigned temporarily to review records. Unfamiliar uniforms stepped down, their posture more rigid, their expressions sharper, eyes scanning not only the prisoners but the guards. Liesel observed from the storage shed doorway as Captain William Carter greeted them with the same even composure he had shown since the first day. No extra stiffness, no defensive tone. He presented documentation, outlined procedures, and walked them through daily operations with quiet clarity. The visiting officers moved through the yard with evaluative glances, noting distances between posts, timing of rotations. The demeanor of prisoners during work detail, when one officer questioned the apparent ease of interaction inside the shed, suggesting that proximity might weaken authority, Carter responded without hesitation that discipline did not require display. He explained that structure was maintained through consistency, not intimidation. His voice did not rise. It did not waver. It simply held. Liesel felt the weight of those words as she resumed sorting supplies, aware that she and the others were being observed as examples of policy. During the review, a brief interruption occurred when a stack of translated inventory sheets slipped from her hands onto the floor, scattering across the boards. The sound echoed in the quiet room. One of the visiting officers turned sharply, expecting disorder. Before tension could gather, Carter stepped forward, crouched to gather the papers alongside her, and handed them back with a nod, stating that clear records ensured efficiency. No reprimand, no rebuke. The gesture lasted only seconds, yet it altered the temperature of the moment. The visiting officers exchanged glances but said nothing further. The inspection concluded without incident, the truck departing through the gate by early afternoon. As the dust settled behind it, the yard returned to its familiar rhythm. Guards resumed rotation. Prisoners continued assigned tasks. Nothing outwardly dramatic had occurred, yet Liesel sensed that something important had been affirmed. Authority had been questioned openly and had responded without fracture. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, casting long amber shadows across the compound, she stood near the fence and reflected on the steady pattern unfolding day by day. She realized that what held her attention so completely was not novelty. It was reliability, strength that did not fluctuate under scrutiny, control that did not tighten when challenged. In a world reshaped by conflict and uncertainty, she had expected authority to feel volatile. Instead it felt measured. And as evening settled gently over the camp, the quiet cadence of boots along the gravel seemed less like surveillance and more like a promise kept, again and again, without announcement. The morning after the inspection carried a clarity that felt almost deliberate. The sky an uninterrupted blue stretching above Camp Weatherby, as if nothing uncertain could exist beneath it. The air held at 62 degrees, crisp but gentle, and sunlight traced clean lines along the fence posts, sharpening every shadow. Liesel stood near the infirmary window reviewing supply tallies when a new notice was posted outside the administrative office. a single sheet of paper secured beneath a metal clip. Word traveled quietly through the compound that minor schedule adjustments would take effect beginning that afternoon. No explanation beyond efficiency. No elaborate directive. Simply an updated order. She stepped outside to read it for herself, noting that work rotations would shift by 30 minutes to accommodate daylight patterns and reduce evening strain. The change was practical, almost invisible to an outsider, yet she understood its significance. Someone had considered fatigue. Before it became a problem, across the yard, Captain William Carter conferred briefly with the sergeant, clarifying details, then walked the line to explain the adjustment in person. He did not delegate the message entirely. He delivered it himself, voice steady, tone even, making certain each group understood the timing. There was no flourish, no attempt to frame it as generosity. It was simply refinement of structure. During the afternoon detail, clouds gathered unexpectedly, and a brief shower passed over the compound, rain tapping sharply against the tin roof of the storage shed. The shift in schedule meant the women were already indoors, protected from the worst of the weather. Liesel felt the small practicality of that decision more strongly than she expected. It was a quiet acknowledgement that comfort and order could coexist. When the rain subsided, puddles reflected the pale sky like fragments of glass scattered across the yard. Carter stepped carefully around them, directing a private to spread sand over the slickest patches before anyone slipped. Again, prevention rather than reaction. As the day progressed, a subtle ease moved through the compound. Not relaxation and discipline, but confidence in routine. Anna remarked that she no longer counted the hours by tension, but by tasks completed. Liesel noticed her own breathing had grown slower, steadier. She had stopped scanning constantly for sudden change. Instead, she observed patterns, learning the rhythm of boots along gravel, the interval between lantern checks, the precise way Carter folded his gloves before entering any enclosed space. These details accumulated into something larger than individual gestures. They formed a standard that did not waver under scrutiny or weather. As evening approached and the temperature dipped back toward 55 degrees, the sky flushed with muted orange along the horizon. Prisoners lined up for final headcount, numbers matching the ledger without delay. Carter closed the book with the same measured motion he had used every night before, neither hurried nor complacent. Liesel realized then that what had once unsettled her had become instructive. She had expected authority to fluctuate with circumstance, to harden under observation and soften when unobserved. Instead, she had witnessed continuity. The same restraint in sunlight and rain, before inspectors and alone, and as dusk settled gently over Camp Weatherby. She understood that the most compelling sight was not power displayed in moments of crisis, but power maintained consistently when nothing dramatic demanded it. That consistency had reshaped the atmosphere of the yard and, quietly, the posture of those who lived within it. The next day unfolded with a deliberate calm. The sky over Camp Weatherby layered in thin white clouds that moved slowly across a soft blue expanse, and the temperature steady at 60 degrees. The yard carried its familiar rhythm, boots crossing gravel in measured intervals, lanterns inspected even in daylight, ledgers reviewed with quiet precision. Yet beneath the routine there was a subtle anticipation, as though the structure itself was about to be tested in a different way. Just after midday, a message arrived from Regional Command requesting a temporary redistribution of supplies to another facility. The request required immediate accounting and reallocation, a task that could easily strain patience and order. Captain William Carter gathered the relevant documents and assembled both guards and prisoner clerks inside the storage shed. There was no urgency in his tone, only clarity. He outlined the quantities required, the timeline, and the process by which each crate would be verified. Liesel stood near the central table, pen poised above the ledger, listening as he divided responsibilities evenly, assigning tasks based on skill rather than rank. No voice rose. No expression hardened. When a discrepancy surfaced between recorded totals and physical count, the room grew still. Such moments often revealed fault lines. Carter stepped forward, examined the figures himself, and calmly requested a recount of one section. He did not accuse. He did not speculate. He relied on verification. Liesel moved through the stacks with deliberate care, rechecking labels she had translated days earlier, fingers brushing across wood worn smooth by handling. Within minutes, the missing units were located behind a secondary shelf, misplaced during the previous adjustment. The tension that had briefly gathered dissolved without spectacle. Carter acknowledged the correction with a simple nod and resumed the distribution plan. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, rustling. The canvas covers over stacked supplies, but inside the shed the cadence of work remained steady. As crates were sealed and documented, he inspected each fastening himself, not to signal distrust but to ensure completion. Liesel observed the consistency once more. Responsibility was neither deflected nor dramatized. It was absorbed and addressed. By late afternoon, the transfer was complete. The wagon prepared for departure. Carter reviewed the final ledger entry and signed it with an even hand. He thanked the assembled workers, guards and prisoners alike, not as a favor, but as recognition of a task finished accurately. The words were brief and without flourish. As the wagon rolled out through the gate, dust lifting lightly behind it, the yard returned to its established pattern. Liesel felt the steady rhythm settle once again, like a metronome that never lost time. She realized that the most significant transformation within her had not come from a single gesture, but from repetition. Discipline maintained through inspection, rain, scrutiny, and now logistical strain. Authority neither inflated nor diminished by circumstance. As evening cooled the air toward 53 degrees and the first lantern flickered to life along the fence, she stood near the compound rail and considered the shape of these days. The men she and the others had watched so intently were not extraordinary in spectacle. They were extraordinary in consistency, and in that unwavering restraint, displayed not once but again and again. She understood that the true measure of strength was not in how loudly it declared itself, but in how quietly it endured. The 11th day dawned with a quiet brightness that felt almost fragile, the sky washed pale and clear above Camp Weatherby, the temperature resting at 58 degrees as a light breeze moved through the yard. The rhythm of routine continued as it always had, yet something subtle had shifted among the women. They no longer gathered in tense clusters before formation. They stood in straighter lines, not from fear, but from decision. Liesel felt it most clearly within herself, the steady alignment of breath and posture that mirrored the discipline she had observed day after day. During morning inspection, Captain William Carter paused slightly longer than usual at the edge of the infirmary path, studying the newly arranged shelves visible through the open door. He did not comment immediately. He stepped inside, removed his gloves, and examined the inventory labels Liesel had rewritten in careful script. His gaze moved methodically from shelf to shelf, confirming placement, confirming order. When he finished, he stated simply that the layout improved efficiency and would remain as standard practice. The words were brief, without embellishment, yet they carried recognition, not personal praise, but acknowledgement of competence. Liesel inclined her head once, accepting the statement as she had seen him accept responsibility for his own decisions. Outside, a minor disturbance rippled near the outer gate when a civilian contractor delivering repair materials appeared. Confused about entry protocol, voices rose slightly as instructions overlapped. Before uncertainty could harden into frustration, Carter approached, clarified the process in measured tones, and repositioned a guard to ensure smoother coordination. Within minutes the exchange settled. No reprimands lingered, no tension spilled outward. The yard resumed its quiet cadence. Anna, standing beside Liesel, whispered that even mistakes here seemed smaller, as if absorbed before they could grow. Liesel considered the thought carefully. She had once believed that authority depended on visible force, on dramatic assertion. Yet, what she had witnessed in these days was different. Strength expressed in calm correction, in consistency under scrutiny, in prevention rather than reaction. As afternoon sunlight warmed the gravel to nearly 65 degrees, the women completed their assigned tasks with renewed steadiness. Liesel found herself adjusting a stack of linens not because she had been told to, but because it aligned with the pattern she now recognized. Discipline was not merely imposed, it could be mirrored. Toward evening, as the air cooled again and shadows stretched long across the compound, Carter walked the perimeter alone, lantern in hand. inspecting each post before nightfall. No one applauded. No one remarked. Yet Liesel understood that the standard he upheld had quietly begun to shape the environment beyond his direct presence. She stood at the rail and watched the final head count conclude, numbers confirmed. Ledger closed with the same measured motion. In the fading light, she realized that the most profound change had occurred not in policy or procedure, but in perception. The yard no longer felt like a place defined solely by confinement. It felt structured, deliberate, almost purposeful, and as the first star appeared faintly above the fence line, Liesel recognized that the reason her gaze had once lingered so intently was no longer mystery. It was clarity. She had been witnessing a standard maintained without spectacle, a form of strength that required no announcement. And in that steady example, something within her had chosen to stand just as upright. The 12th morning arrived wrapped in a quiet haze, the kind that softened edges without obscuring them, and the temperature held steady at 60 degrees as light drifted across the yard of Camp Weatherby. Nothing dramatic marked the day, no inspection, no logistical strain, yet Liesel sensed a culmination forming beneath the routine. During early detail, she organized the final stack of translated records, aligning each sheet with deliberate precision, aware that what had begun as adaptation had become intention. Across the yard, Captain William Carter moved through his usual circuit, boots steady on gravel, posture unchanged, the ledger tucked beneath his arm. He paused at each post not because it was required by oversight, but because consistency demanded it. Near midday, a small but telling moment unfolded. One of the newer guards, inexperienced and eager to assert authority, spoke too sharply while directing a pair of prisoners toward the tool shed. The tone was not cruel, but it carried unnecessary edge. The air shifted slightly, a reminder of how quickly discipline could tilt. Carter approached without haste and asked the guard to repeat the instruction at normal volume. No public rebuke, no humiliation. Only correction through example. The guard complied, voice moderated, posture adjusted. The incident dissolved as quietly as it had formed. Liesel watched from a distance, understanding that restraint required vigilance not only over prisoners but over those who held power. Later that afternoon, the women were permitted to reorganize a small patch of soil beside the infirmary, intended for herbs to assist with minor ailments. It was a modest allowance, practical rather than sentimental. Liesel knelt in the earth, cool beneath her palms, and pressed seeds into straight rows, measuring distance by instinct. Anna worked beside her, movement steady, no longer tentative. When Carter passed by, he paused only long enough to confirm that tools would be returned before dusk. He did not comment on the garden. He did not claim credit. Yet the space itself represented a subtle evolution within the camp. Structure had made room for utility beyond mere containment. As the sun lowered and the light turned amber across the gravel, Liesel stood and brushed soil from her hands, observing the perimeter with a clarity she had not possessed upon arrival. She recognized now that the reason her attention had lingered so intensely in those first days was not fascination with uniform or bearing. It was the search for pattern in a world that had felt unstable. What she had found was not softness, not indulgence, but unwavering alignment between word and action. Evening formation proceeded beneath a sky streaked faintly with pink, the temperature dipping toward 54 degrees. Numbers were called, matched, confirmed. The ledger closed with the same measured motion. Liesel inhaled the cooling air and felt a steady resolve settle within her. Captivity remained unchanged in fact, yet its atmosphere had been reshaped by example. Strength expressed without spectacle, authority maintained without volatility. As lanterns flickered on along the fence line and shadows lengthened across the yard, she understood that the most enduring transformation was quiet. It did not announce itself. It simply endured, steady as the cadence of boots along gravel, consistent enough to alter not only the space it governed, but the posture of those who witnessed it. The 13th morning did not announce itself as an ending. It arrived the way the others had, with cool air resting at 56 degrees and a pale sky stretching quietly above Camp Weatherby. Yet Liesel felt the difference before the bell rang. It was not in the wind or the light, but in the steadiness of her own breath. Formation assembled as usual, boots aligned, names spoken, Numbers confirmed. Captain William Carter moved along the line with the same measured pace, ledger in hand, gloves folded precisely before he addressed the yard. Nothing in his posture suggested culmination. He had never performed authority as spectacle, and he would not begin now. During the morning detail, word circulated that regional command would be reducing temporary staffing in the coming weeks, consolidating oversight as operations stabilized. The announcement carried no drama, only administrative inevitability. Liesel listened without outward reaction, yet she understood that cycles were shifting. Beyond the fence line, change would come, as it always did. What remained uncertain was not policy but memory. Near midday, Carter visited the small herb patch beside the infirmary, kneeling briefly to examine the first faint green shoots pressing through the soil. He did not comment on growth. He simply ensured the wooden border was secure and that the watering schedule would continue. Liesel watched from the doorway, recognizing the same principle applied from the first day: attention to what could be maintained, not what could be claimed. Later, a final minor test presented itself. A new guard, assigned only that morning, questioned why prisoners were permitted to handle written records so freely. The inquiry was not hostile, but skeptical. Carter answered without irritation, explaining that accountability functioned best when clarity was shared. He spoke of standards rather than suspicion, of consistency rather than control. The guard listened, then nodded. The exchange ended as quietly as it had begun. Liesel felt something close within her then, a circle completed. The reason her gaze had once lingered so intensely across this yard was no longer curiosity. It was confirmation. She had searched for fracture, for volatility, for the moment restraint would dissolve under pressure. It had not. Day after day, inspection after inspection, rain and sunlight alike, the standard had remained intact. As evening descended and the temperature dipped toward 50 degrees, lanterns ignited along the fence in their usual sequence. Head count concluded with the same measured cadence. The ledger closed. Boots traced the perimeter once more. Liesel stood at the rail and allowed herself a final, steady look across the yard. She did not see spectacle. She saw continuity, authority exercised without excess, strength held in reserve. In that quiet consistency, something within her had been recalibrated. She had not been changed by persuasion or sentiment, but by example. And as the last light thinned across the gravel, she understood that dignity does not require volume. It requires repetition. The quiet ones are never truly ordinary, and neither are the standards they choose to uphold. She did not raise her voice. She raised her own measure of what strength could be.